Today, this is what men are dealing with in the workplace. They're trying to figure out how to be, and likewise with women also. So I'm just going to kind of break this down as quickly as possible. Basically, the word masculinity, refers to a male person. And toxic masculinity, or masculinity is a concept. So it doesn't exist in and of itself. It's how we socially construct male and male energy. And it's a gender expression, certainly. It has various forms that are healthy and neutral, and it can integrate other ideas and expressions, such as the feminine, into it. So we talk about men that are masculine, that have a strong feminine, and these are social constructs, basically. But it's not necessarily static, and it varies from person to person. Therefore, it can also be toxic, because we know a lot of men that we love that are feminists, that would never, overstep a boundary, come on in, or do anything inappropriate, and yet we do have a culture now of toxic masculinity that you can see, unfortunately, on our socio-political landscape right now, certainly in a lot of newsrooms on the internet, some really disgusting misogyny, and increasing violence in internet pornography as well. So we have all these polarizations going on in our culture and across the planet. I'm sure you've all noticed the very strong forces of good and, quote, evil at this moment. And I think that's also emblematic of change and how change happens. But there's a sense that women are starting to move into sort of a new wave of rights and liberation, and you see this across the planet also. But toxic masculinity is a term that's broadly impacting our culture, and especially people that are marginalized, people of color, cisgender women, queer folks, gender nonconforming people, such as those who identify as trans or those who identify as non-binary. And other cisgender men can be the victims of toxic masculinity. And in fact, men are most likely victims of male violence. Men perpetrate violence on other men more than women perpetrate violence on men. And keep in mind that statistically most men are not violent, but most egregious physical violence is committed by men. All you have to do is look at all these mass shooters. None of them have been female. Most of them have been white men. So let's take a look at this video. Some of you have probably seen this, but if you haven't, it's quite striking. Gillette put this video out, and there was a lot of pushback after this came out.
Bullying.
The metoo movement against...
We're in the midst of just enormous change. And I was talking to Michelle, and all you have to do is just pick a topic today, and it's in the midst of enormous change. But we're in the business of mental health and working with men and women. And so how can we start to, shift and change our ideas in the way that Corey was talking about weight and how it impacts us? I mean, that's a really great topic. But also our own sexuality. How do we comport ourselves? What does it mean? And how do we help the people we're working with? So with men, I think questions like, does the image he have of himself align with the way the world perceives him? Like, I'm a good guy, but is he really perceived as a good guy? And what does a good guy mean? How do you deconstruct that with somebody? And does he currently, or has he ever abused a power dynamic? Especially a white male, because so many white men do not understand the notion of white privilege. They just don't get it. And they think it's absurd, and those are the men that really pushed back against that Gillette video when it came out. So one thing you can do is ask him to consider a female in his life, and imagine her in a similar sexual situation that they've been in before. A male shows interest in her, decides to take her out. She's super excited, and we'll talk about why women get so excited. And after the date, they agree to go back to her place, and they start to make out, and she says no. But he gently and slowly coerces her into not stopping, and they end up having intercourse even though she didn't really want to. And every woman in this room has been in that situation. Whether you were in high school or college or last week. And is he concerned about what happened to his female friend or family member? And should he be, and how does he feel about this? If this was his daughter, that thing that he did. Because that's sort of a victim empathy exercise. And the reason sexual power dynamics don't change, I think, is because we're usually given examples of like a sheet of what you can say and what you can't say. And of course, people hate that because it's so rote and constricting, and it really doesn't work. And this conquest model is a pervasive model that exists, it's alive and well today, certainly in high school, and you see it more in everywhere from lower socioeconomics to Ivy League guys in college. So we're usually sort of conditioned to look at things as what's legal and what isn't. How does the law define sexual harassment? And definitions about what's appropriate. But if we look at those situations based on those definitions, it's not much to aspire to. It just sort of leaves us constricted because what we're supposed to do and not do. And it's kind of the lowest common denominator, like what can I get away with legally, is not about my integrity. So what if the new masculinity is simply about common decency? What if it's this super low-tech, going back to a different time and place where people treated each other with integrity? So maybe it's about values we can all relate to. Like, what does it mean to be respectful or have respect, or to have dignity, or decorum, or to be in your integrity? These are the self-reflexive questions we want to be talking to men about, which we talk about if we're working in recovery with people all the time. Because people that are in their addiction, whatever it is, they're out of their integrity. So how do we help people recalibrate their compass? And I know with men that are identified as sexually addicted or compulsive, they'll tell me all the time that they cross lines they never thought they would cross. They were violating their value systems all the time because their compass was so far off for a whole host of reasons. So how do we get back to what is true for me? How do I feel like I have self-respect? And how might they think about this issue differently if they were operating from a place of their own dignity and respect, as opposed to what people say they should and shouldn't do? What does it mean to be a decent human being, a good neighbor, a good citizen? So we have to consciously examine our intentions and admit also our shadow into our relationships, our interpersonal relationships, which is, the mind has no pride. You can look at somebody and think they're really terrific, and at the same time you have images of having sex with them or stealing their jacket, or it's just all over the map. And so you can't act like that's not going on. That happens in therapy when you have any kind of erotic countertransference with someone. You have to own that that's happening, otherwise you're going to have an enactment or something horrible is going to happen. So we have to admit that we're affected by one another and observe how our unresolved issues get stirred up, and then make adjustments accordingly. So if somebody's really aroused by somebody in the workplace, or they're objectifying them sexually, you need to have a conversation with them about, let's talk about what's actually really going on there and how you're going to handle this. So when we examine our behaviors and motives, and look at how the cultural rules and rules are constructing that, we start to see a little bit about who we are separate from what we're supposed to be doing, or our ideas, or their ideas of being masculine. So being part of the solution is about being a humanitarian, practicing common decency, staying in your dignity, respecting other people, letting your principles guide you, and being vulnerable and talking about your shadow side and the things that you think that are your deepest, darkest, dirtiest secrets. So where consent is concerned, consent means to give approval or to assent, and it means compliance of what is done or proposed by another. It's an agreement or an opinion. So it's a voluntary agreement between two people. And consent is not a one and done thing. Consent is fluid, it's ongoing. What happened in 2017, you may remember that the Shitty Men in Media document, it was a Google Doc that was started by one woman, and she sent it to her friends, and before they knew it, it just went viral, talking about what these men did. They made columns of their names, last names, and their affiliation and what they did. And that's when the MeToo movement was born. So where women are concerned, because women are complicit in this, and it's not the complicit, disgusting statement of when you're raped, what was your part in it? It's not that. But it's about the third wave feminism rolled around the Girls Gone Wild era in the 90s, and it was really about fucking without feelings. this notion of slut pride. And it was born to attack the double standard that women could have pleasure in the same way men did, and it didn't have to be committed, it didn't have to mean anything, and it didn't mean that women were sluts or whores or anything else. It just meant we had genitals and we wanted to have sex and enjoy it for pleasure's sake. And this offered women a huge space to find out about what they wanted sexually and to be unapologetic about it. Even though it turns out, studies show that many women don't like anonymous or casual sex. And so Girls Gone Wild was about doing what women thought men wanted. And there's a great book about this called Female Chauvinist Pig by Ariel Levy. And it's a really eye-opening book about how women, especially women like Christy Hefner, were a party to objectifying women and using women as sex objects, for consumerism. So women, interestingly, first of all, women can get turned on by anything. There are studies that show that you can show women pornography of goldfish having sex, and we lubricate. Goldfish, bonobos, same sex, opposite sex, it doesn't matter. Whereas men have much more specific arousal templates when it comes to the Kinsey scale of homosexual to heterosexual. But we're like totally in the bell curve. And so we get super turned on when we're making out, but we can stop when we feel like we've had enough, right? It's like, that's enough, cuddling, being sexual, but it doesn't have to go to intercourse. But males experience that activity very differently with their accompanying arousal because of what it takes to get an erection physiologically. And so they see it as a green light towards genital sex, and they'll cajole a female to keep going because they don't get that her no really means no, because for them it's like, how could that possibly be? So women tend to acquiesce to men, even though they don't state at the beginning of the encounter, or they do state that they don't want to have sex, and they go through sex, they're able to orgasm, but they feel sad, and later they get angry. So a couple things about this. I talked to my 23-year-old niece about this, and I asked her, does this happen with your girlfriends? And she said, yeah. And I said, how come? And she said, because nobody wants to create a scene. It's not that big of a deal. We don't want to hurt his feelings. That came up so many times, this orientation to caretaking to the male. Because women know evolutionarily, biologically, and implicitly that men are more fragile than women are in that way. Their virility is tied to their sexuality in the way it's not for us. And so as such, women will acquiesce. In general, females, as I said, want to make men happy, override their own needs. She tells herself it's okay, she's cool with what she's doing, that she doesn't mean she's being forced, and like she doesn't have a choice. And we're brought up, and this obviously is a very heterosexist configuration of this problem, but we're brought up to think that we're supposed to get male attention to get a husband. So it's impolite to say no, since she's concerned again about hurting his feelings, but that maybe she could even lose him if she said no. So he cajoles and convinces her the reason she's saying no is stupid, and she says no, and then he does it anyway. All the while she's struggling with, how do I give him what he wants in a way that's not really terrible for me. This is especially difficult if she said no several times and he hasn't stopped. And her bind is between taking care of him versus what she needs. And she's grappling with a million things, and we've all been there. Well, he's not paying attention to her, and he's only after one thing only, right? I mean, you think about that, the times that you've had sex and maybe didn't really want to, all the things going on in your head while you're trying to accommodate in this weird way. So girls, there's the good girl code, and then Kelly McDaniel lays out the 4 cultural beliefs in her book, Ready to Heal, for women recovering from sex and love addiction. But women are taught to be people pleasers. Female infants are born with the capacity to read facial cues, and girls and women survive by being aware and reading social cues. So we're reading cues all the time. Boys don't read cues at birth and early on. It takes a while for that facility to come online for them because they're actually much more immature at birth than female infants are. Their brains are more immature. We know that men get angry, lash out, or happy, and we're safe or not safe, so we're calibrating that all the time. And sex can be a social currency to stay safe and belong. It's important to be liked by someone who has your fate in their hands. So you have to ask females also, does the image she have of herself align with the way the world perceives her? What are you putting out into the world? And does she buy into the patriarchy? And if so, how does she contribute to that? And I'll tell you, the way it most shows up is how women dress in the workplace. And I had this conversation with some of the lawyers, and one of the female lawyers was incensed by this notion that, you know, women should be able to dress any way they want to. And there was a guy in the audience who was like your average straight guy, you know, checked shirt, glasses. And he said that he was part of a committee that was recruiting a student liaison to work with the law department at this university, and they had a breakfast meeting, and she showed up, and you know, she like all T&A, the whole thing, high heels, short skirt, boobs, and he said I had to sit next to her because I know I'd be staring at her breasts, and he said it was really uncomfortable for me. And yet we're saying to men, well, you just need to get over that. When men are wired to look at boobs, that's why boobs are there in part. And so how is she using her sexuality to get ahead? And that's buying into the patriarchy, as opposed to, I'm here for my intelligence, I'm here to do a good job. It doesn't mean you don't dress appropriately or you feel good about yourself, but it's like, how much are you showing? Is this a club or is this a workplace? And if men look, are you going to go slap them with a sexual harassment suit? You know, what are women's part in this process? And does she use her sexuality in a way that gives males mixed messages? Does she silently condone and side with the problem that also violates her? So communication's not just about talking. It's difficult. It involves the invisible social and historical constructs at play. It's a shared language. There are a million ways to say no and stop. These forces impact how entitled we feel with our comfort and how likely we are to put others' needs in front of ours. And it's the invisible things that create problems. It's not the spoken, it's the unspoken. So current male fear may have men to begin to pay attention to many things that are taking place in the room. Males should analyze the process and look at their own part in it. And they should be aware of power dynamics and talk about them, the ways they're scary, fun, or pleasure to engender trust. The way sympathetic arousal works and what it takes for males to get up over the arousal threshold means their right amygdala has to be off and their higher cortical functions. Their reflective functions have to be offline because all systems are go towards orgasm. So it's hard to ask somebody who's like in the heat of the moment to be tracking the other person to see if they're okay, because they're just focused on one thing now. So this has to happen on the front end. And consent is fluid. It's absolutely fluid. So we create less stigma about explicit conversations. When she says that was terrible for me, the other party should say, let's talk about it, instead of gaslighting her and saying, what are you talking about? Or it wasn't that bad, or you're making a big deal out of that. You were fine, you had an orgasm, didn't you? If the person had a bad experience with you, then you probably regret it. What would you do sexually? Is that what others expect you to do, or what you really want? So how do people talk about it if it was bad afterwards? Context can be historical, like race, class, gender, or any other power differential. And it can be situational, as when someone's in love with the other party and the other party isn't. So the person who isn't in love can sense that the smitten party will do what they want. They now have a responsibility. Am I going to go through with this, or aren't I? Because am I leading this person on? Is this opportunistic now? And when things are uneven, the person in power has to take extra care to allow for an environment that says no. That they know that they're not really into this person, but you know, it's for fun and for free, so why shouldn't I go through it? The question then is, what is the damage you see on the horizon? And is it really worth it for you to hurt this person because you're using them, essentially? It's affirmative, it's verbal, and it can be withdrawn at any time. So you can say yes to A and B, but not C. And even in the middle of a sex act, if someone agrees to a sex act and in the middle of it, it doesn't feel good, or they wish they weren't doing it, it's okay to say, stop, I don't want to do this anymore. Or stop, you know, you're hurting me, or that's too rough. I thought your idea of rough was a little hair pulling, but now you're really, you know, bruising my rear end, and that's not okay with me. Now the problem is, the whole hook in this whole thing is if you've got a female, and especially those of you working with women in recovery, they're already struggling with pathological dissociation, or they wouldn't be addicts to begin with. And they already don't know how to say no. So now we're asking them to say no during sex when they're likely at least moderately dissociated, if not severely. And so this is where this gets tricky, and this is why we can recommend abstinence for people for a long time, because they can't actually take care of themselves. And if you think some guy with a hard-on is going to take care of you, you're living in an alternate universe. It's not going to happen. So these are thin slices, but for those who do have their higher cortical functions online, it's okay to say, stop, that's hurting me. Even if you're, not quite lubricating, or you're not really ready, or you've just decided, you know what, I'm not really into this. We just need to stop now. So consent is knowing that the other person's excited about what's going on. It's clear that both parties are on the same page. And the BDSM community, they say that consent is a hell yeah, right? And anything short of that is not consensual. So that community talks about RAC, which is risk-aware consensual kink, and also safe, sane, and consensual. So these are sort of earmarks for consent. And you want people to be adult, to take responsibility for communicating, and also if you fail to communicate, there's actually an app called We Consent. And consent, again, means that you're giving someone permission to do something to you, because we're having sex with someone else. So here are some ABCs of consent. The first one is awareness. How aware are you of your body? What do you want from your sexual experience? What do you like sexually? What do you need in order to feel safe to have sex? What is pleasurable for you? How much time have you spent investigating these questions? That's why that yes, no, maybe handout is useful for you. And taking people through these questions. And do you know what a boundary is? And are you available for sex on your first, second, third, fourth date? What is the boundary? And what about intercourse? And are there parts of your body you don't want touched? And does no mean no? And how do you talk about your wants and needs to a partner? Can you communicate your boundaries? So you can see that therapeutically you want to work with A first, and then B helps somebody set those boundaries. The harder one is when they're faced with someone else to actually talk about all the things they've unpacked with you. And can men empower women without being seductive, feeling weak, or like they're going to lose something? This is a big deal in our culture now because we've got the battle of the sexes going. Why are men so threatened by female power? What do they think we're going to really take from them? But when men that are in power actually champion women, that's super sexy, at least to me. And I would imagine all of you. Can women stand in their power without choking off their femininity or turning themselves into sex objects? Because women that turn themselves into sex objects are disempowering themselves. That's not real power. And how do both genders honor each other's humanity is also the question we're putting forth. So other questions is, how do you contribute to the problem to get people to really be reflexive internally? What way are you contributing to this problem? What solutions can you bring to your dating life on a daily basis? What are your personal values? And in my workbook, Sexual Reflections, I really have people, I think also in erotic intelligence, there's something about values, but in Sexual Reflections, they're looking at what their personal values are and what turns them on sexually, and do these two things align? And if they don't, let's talk about where the misalignment is, because in sex addiction, for example, there is a disconnect between personal values and what people are doing sexually. So we want to get people in alignment so their erotic template and what they want to do sexually aligns with their value system. It's that simple and complicated. And what are your personal guiding principles? How do you want to be treated in romantic relationships? If you're attracted to someone in life or in the workplace, what's an appropriate way to approach that person based on your values and your principles? Or is the workplace even appropriate, or maybe it's just out of bounds? And how do you intervene when you see inappropriate dynamics taking place? And the way we saw the men in the Gillette commercial, intervening. So any questions?